You all so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about Senate Bill 7. We're going to give folks just one moment to come in from the waiting room and join us, and then we will get started. All right. Looks like we have a pretty full house today, and I know it is a Sunday, and so we will delve right in. So I am Rose Clouston, the Voter Protection Director at the Texas Democratic Party. And we appreciate so much all of the elected officials, state leaders, and members of the press that have joined us here today because we're all invested in Texas's democracy. And I sincerely wish that we were here under much different circumstances where we could be celebrating triumphs in the state legislative session and advances and modernizations to our democracy. But sadly, yet again, we are here because we have to fight for the basic tenets of voting rights and democracy in our state. This legislative session in Texas has been one of missed opportunities. We're reeling from a pandemic and a winter storm that have killed far too many of our neighbors. And the Republican-dominated legislature has done next to nothing about either of these crises. Instead, they focused on spreading lies to stoke fear about our elections and targeted many vulnerable Texans. So unfortunately, I'm not surprised that on the second to last day of the legislative session, the last day that we have to pass most bills, we're here in the wake of the state Senate casting its final vote on the racist, ableist, anti-voter Senate Bill 7, and we're awaiting the House taking up this bill today. So today we're going to hear from Democratic leaders throughout Texas about where we are in this fight, what's at stake for Texas voters, and where we go from here. So let us get started with, I believe that we have Senator Alvarado with us, who is the Senate Democratic Caucus Chair and was up all night asking questions and debating the latest version of Senate Bill 7. So there were a lot of procedural issues and questions raised because of the secrecy in which this bill was crafted. And Senator Alvarado, can you talk to us a little bit about what happened last night and how we got there?
Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for joining. It's Jim Crow 2.0. Here we go. Last night was probably one of the lowest moments that I've experienced in my legislative career. If you just look about how the process went, you see this big document right here. We received this report about 3:30 yesterday, and then less than 3 hours later, Chairman Hughes suspended the rules to bring up the bill. And it was done in a very unusual way, because usually you don't suspend the rules until right before you're going to bring up the bill. But they did this hours ahead of time, and this document wasn't eligible to even be brought up until today, about 2:30 or 2:45. And I think they realized they were within a filibuster range, and we were prepared. That was the plan, was to filibuster and kill it. But then they suspended the rules. As y'all know, the Lieutenant Governor and the Republicans in the Senate changed the rules, so they only needed 18 votes to suspend. And let's also talk about the transparency issue. Senator Powell was the only Democrat on the conference committee, and she was completely shut out of the process. She didn't get a draft of this large document until 11:30 the night before it was filed the next day at 9 a.m. She wasn't included in any discussions, nor were any of the concerns that she raised addressed. So from the beginning, this was a rushed process, and there are provisions in this new document that were not in either bill, and we can talk about that next.
Thank you, Senator Alvarado. And a quick note for those of you who are joining us, if you are on the Zoom and you are a member of the media and you have a question, please put that in the chat, and please include your outlet in your question. And you can send that to the host and they will filter that to us, and we'll get to those at the end. And then if you are joining us on the Zoom, you can click closed captions at the bottom and have the captions up. If you are on the Facebook Live, those should be available for you already. So quick housekeeping notes, and then we'll delve back into the substance. So let's speaking of that, the procedural note, Senator Alvarado, of some of those pieces of this Frankenstein bill not being in anything that the Senate had heard on Senate Bill 7 or that the House had heard in their hearings. Representative Gonzalez, I know as vice chair of the House Elections Committee, you sat through and discussed all of the bills and elections that the House Elections Committee has heard during every single hearing, many late into the night. Can you talk to us about one or two of the provisions in this latest version of the bill that your committee wasn't able to vet, and what impact that has on your ability to deliberate this bill when the House gets to it later today?
And it seems just like yesterday that SB 7, was ran through our committee. But yes, there were several provisions that came back, from I guess the last version that we got. And I'm not on the conference committee. Actually, none of the Democrats, and at least on the House side, even served on the elections committee. So that made it, so they were looking at this legislation, for the first time. A lot of them, or not for the very first time, but in depth in that regard. There was a provision in there. I don't recall it being in either of the version, whether in the Senate or the House version, that makes it easier for elections to get contested. And it's my understanding that you don't even have to prove whether there was voter fraud or not in order for you to overturn election results. Clearly, that's stemming from, the big lie, right? There were several provisions that I worked closely with Chair Collier and, Chair Canales, in providing feedback. There were some, provisions that, clearly, is aimed at affecting the souls of the polls, which is going to affect the African-American vote. And there really is no reason for, those limitations on time. How is that aimed at preventing voter fraud, right? Saying that, okay, you can only start voting at 1 p.m. on Sundays. And so, there were, and I'm trying to recall some other provisions in there, but there were, the backdoor voter ID provision. We were working to try to get them to remove that. And they're making it easier for it to go through the court process as well. Now, folks will be able to, it'll be expedited in criminal court, as if, the system already isn't clogged up as it is, right? It creates civil penalties on top of criminal penalties. So there's a whole host of issues. We're hoping that we were going to get at least some kind of movement from our on their end, but there wasn't. They didn't really seem to want to have us in the conversation. I know initially, Senator Powell didn't even receive a copy of anything. She had to seek it. She had to send a letter. Same thing with Chair Collier. She was having a very difficult time. And so just the whole process, right? It just goes to show, this underhanded behavior just goes to show really what their real intent is, behind this bill and doing it in that regard and just ignoring the process. Even just, in committee. We saw, you were there, Rose, at the, in the hearings. Just the whole thing, just trying to shove this bill through. And then we want to wait till last minute and, trying to speed up the process. This bill, it's massive. And for it to be rushed through the conferees, even rushed the day that it came to the floor and trying to find some kind of compromise, which, those amendments were stripped, of course, right? The amendments that we got on that were Democrat amendments got stripped. And so, it's an awful bill, but I'm hopeful that these, this underhanded behavior, the way that they undercut the process, will help us when we litigate this, because I think that's going to be crucial, to point those things out.
Thank you very much, Representative Gonzalez. And we'll hear from Chair Collier in a little bit and delve into those. I'm sure many of our reporters are going to ask you questions now that you've opened the door to that litigation question. I think we're already getting some of those. But let's talk a little bit more about what we're hearing from our communities and what the impacts of this legislation are. So would love to talk to Secretary Castro and Congressman O'Rourke first up. We've heard over and over again from civil rights organizations, voting rights organizations, and activists that this bill discriminates against voters of color. Could you explain some of the effects that Senate Bill 7 would have on the ground in your communities that are going to make it harder for folks to vote? Starting out with Secretary Castro, please.
Thanks a lot, Rose. It's great to be here with everybody on the call, and thank you to Chairman Hinojosa for his leadership and to Senator Alvarado and Representative Gonzalez. This is a state of emergency for democracy in Texas. If Senate Bill 7 becomes law, it's going to make it so much harder for everyday people in Texas to cast their ballot, especially communities of color, by doing things like making it harder for people with disabilities to vote, by undermining the ability of people who worship on a Sunday morning and then want to go and vote right after that to do so conveniently, by banning things like drive-through voting and 24-hour voting that were tremendously successful in Harris County in 2020. This is going to make it harder for the average Texan to get out and cast their ballot, whether they're Republican or Democrat. But it is clearly aimed at people of color, at Black and Hispanic Texans. The Republican Party is running scared because they know that this state is changing, and they're afraid of the consequences. Senate Bill 7 is an attempt by the Republican Party to stay in power, to hold on to their power at the expense of everybody else. And we can't let it stand.
Thank you. Congressman O'Rourke, would you like to add anything to that?
Rose, thank you for organizing this. And I've got to thank Senator Alvarado and her colleagues for fighting the good fight all night last night. Amy and I tried to stay up with you. We made it till about 2 a.m. and then we had to call it quits, but you all were there well into the sunrise when this thing finally passed at 6. And then Vice Chair Gonzalez, you are kicking so much ass on behalf of the people of Texas. And I just want to thank you for doing that. You're fighting for everyone, Democrats, Republicans, independents, just Texans being able to vote. That's what this is about. And let's get out of the technicalities and the details of the legislation and just look at what's happening to our democracy. This is the toughest state in the union in which to register and cast a ballot, bar none. And they're going to make it even harder to vote if this thing passes today in the House and is signed by Governor Abbott. You should care about that no matter what party you belong to, no matter who you want to vote for in the next election, because there might be a future election in which you cannot vote at all. That's the path that we're on today. You know, back before LBJ was president, states like Texas and Georgia and Florida used laws like these to keep some people, primarily Black people, Mexican-American people, communities of color, young people, the very old, from being able to vote freely. They did it with the poll tax. They did it with the literacy test. They did it with how many jelly beans are in this jar. And then you had LBJ and some extraordinary members of Congress like Joaquin Castro, like Colin Allred, who stepped up and did the right thing and voted for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which standardized elections across this country so that you could not prevent anybody who was an eligible voter from casting their ballot. That's what we need right now. And I'm really counting on Congressman Allred and Congressman Castro and their colleagues and President Biden to pass the For the People Act in the United States Senate. Now, it's passed the House. It now needs to pass the Senate. If we do that, then we have a Voting Rights Act for our day, and we can protect the sanctity of the ballot box and make sure that no state legislature in any state can keep us from voting. So I hope after this good fight is fought in Texas, that we direct all of our energy and all of our focus on our friends in Washington, D.C., who, like they did in 1965, can save American democracy and keep it from reverting into Jim Crow 2.0.
That is a perfect segue, Congressman O'Rourke. Thank you so much. Want to turn that question over to Congressman Allred and Congressman Castro. Yesterday, President Biden issued a statement condemning SB 7 and similar legislation passed in other states. We've all heard about what has happened in Georgia and Florida. He called again on Congress to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I know you both, along with the rest of the Democratic congressional delegation from Texas, signed a letter to that effect last week. What would the impact of those two federal laws be for us in Texas, especially if Senate Bill 7 passes? What are we hoping to accomplish with that? Congressman Allred, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, thank you to all of my friends. It's good to see you. This is, one of the darkest days for our democracy here in the state of Texas and in the country. I mean, this is so incredibly dangerous. What happened in the middle of the night, behind closed doors, without anybody being able to see, probably with outside groups handing legislative language in to try and make it harder for Texans to vote after a safe and secure election. Those aren't my words. That's a smooth and secure election. That's from one of the state's top elections officials, in which 11 million Texans voted, all in pursuit of satisfying this idea of the big lie that the 2020 election was fraudulent, that Donald Trump apparently should still be president of the United States. I mean, every American needs to be watching what's happening in Texas right now. And we have to have a federal response to this, because this has gone way too far. When we're talking about that you can get beer at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, but you can't go vote after you leave church anymore because they're afraid of souls to the polls. I mean, come on. Like, what are we talking about here? This isn't legislation. This is discrimination. And it's time for us to do something at the federal level, since it's clear that far too many of our state capitals have lost any sense of their responsibility to their constituents. And so the For the People Act that Beto mentioned would standardize and set national standards so that we don't have to have our democracy look radically different from state to state. It would address cuts to early voting by requiring a 15-day early voting period. Of course, we have that in Texas. It would require early voting sites to be open for at least 10 hours a day. On voter registration, it would establish automatic and same-day voter registration so we could stop some of this nonsense that we do in this state around voter registration. Or vote by mail. It would prohibit states from requiring an excuse like we have here in Texas, where you have to be 65 or older, have a disability, or be out of the state for the entire period to enable to vote by mail, and require prepayment of postage for ballots and applications. It would also end partisan gerrymandering in congressional districts, which we know is going to happen to our 38 now congressional districts coming up here quite soon. If you think this is bad, just wait till you see the gerrymander that's going to come out of this same legislature. And so we have to have a federal response to this. And I am so thankful that President Biden has stood up so quickly and so forcefully talking about this, because our democracy is at risk. This is not about getting Democrats elected or Republicans elected. 11 million Texans voted last election, and Republicans still won. What are they so afraid of? What are they so afraid of? Let people vote. Let them vote and let the chips fall where they may. I was a voting rights lawyer before I came to Congress. And I can tell you, some of this stuff that we're seeing here today should end up in court and should be struck down immediately. But how many millions of dollars in tax dollars is that going to cost the people of Texas to defend these discriminatory provisions? This is outrageous, and we have to have a federal response. The Congress, the House has already acted. We need the Senate to act. I don't expect our senators to act, but we need the Senate to act, to pass the For the People Act, and we're going to pass H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, soon, to restore the aspects of the Voting Rights Act that were struck down by the Supreme Court. Together, that will give us a sword and a shield. Through H.R. 1, the For the People Act, we will affirmatively expand voting rights, give people national standards so that states won't be able to cut off their ability to vote. And the Voting Rights Act will give them a shield to defend themselves if something does get through that, so that they can challenge it and it can be prevented from taking place. Because ultimately, what we're trying to do here is just make sure that our democracy still exists. For my two young sons, for the country that we want to be, this is extremely dangerous. I was in the Capitol on January 6th when those rioters broke in and tried to kill the Speaker of the House and the Vice President and overturn a presidential election. This bill is in service of that attack on the Capitol, of that attack on our democracy, and it can't stand.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Congressman. Congressman Castro, would you like to add anything to that about the...
Sure. Thank you. And Colin said it very well. And I also want to echo the thank you to the state legislators who were fighting all night and all session before that against this and other extreme right bills like the abortion bill, the permitless carry bill on guns, and so many others. And this is a now or never moment for American democracy. And I urge my colleagues in the House of Representatives and also the United States senators, most especially, to look at what is going on in places like Arizona, Georgia, and Texas, and realize that Republicans keep moving to the extreme right, but they keep changing the law
to keep winning. All we have to do to make it easier to vote is not change any law. We just have to change a custom, the Senate filibuster. If we don't act now, then our democracy is not going to look the same either in 2022 or 2024. We're dealing with folks who have moved to the extreme right, and the way they're trying to win elections now is not by convincing more people that they've got great ideas or that they're great at governing. It's by keeping the people who disagree with them from actually showing up and casting a ballot. That's why they're making it harder for Black churches to organize and get their parishioners to the polls on Sunday morning. Why in the world would you pick Sunday morning to outlaw voting in Texas? But for the fact that they know that a lot of Black parishioners historically have chosen that time to organize and go to the polls. So these laws that you're seeing across the country, and this law in Texas, is in service to a party that is not representative of the diversity of the state in any way, and is doing everything that it possibly can to cling on to power despite the changing politics of Texas and the more competitive races that we saw, especially with Beto in 2018 and Justin Nelson and others. But even 2020 was closer than we saw 6 years ago or 10 years ago. And so it's incumbent upon the United States Congress and the United States Senate to do something about this. We have the power to stop this in Washington, and we need to use it.
Thank you, Congressman. We all sincerely hope that your colleagues in the Senate are listening loud and clear and hearing that message, because we need them for sure. So now, one of the things that we've heard all session in talking about Senate Bill 7 and all of the voter suppression measures has been about Harris County and how these measures specifically target all of the voter access provisions that Harris County created to adapt to the pandemic last year. We have with us Judge Lina Hidalgo, the county judge for Harris County. Judge Hidalgo, can you talk to us a little bit about what the impact of this law would have on your county?
Yes, we had record turnout this past November in Harris County. We were an incredible national model for what accessible and safe and secure elections look like. And it was Democrats and Republicans with drive-through voting, with 24-hour voting, no evidence of fraud whatsoever, needless to say. But this bill does away with that. 24-hour voting, drive-through voting in particular, disproportionately used by voters of color. And so it's very transparent what their motivation is. But look, one thing we have to recognize is they're not only going after Harris County because they see us innovating. I mean, it's just hard for me to understand why they would stand in the way of innovation and something that helps their own voters. What the proponents of this bill are also doing is just weakening the core of our democracy. This provision that makes it easier for elections to be overturned. That is it's almost hard to believe that truly can be part of a bill of real legislation, that we're having a conversation about that. It's very clear where these guys are coming from. They've recognized that if they pander to the people who believe the election was stolen, that'll help them politically. But those political points that they might score, that doesn't justify tearing down our democracy. It doesn't justify making policy based on this flawed idea that elections need to be overturned, that the 2020 election needs to be overturned. If you make policy based on that, if serious people, serious legislators in this enormous, powerful state that Texas is, if they make policy based on that, they only cement this sense that American democracy is broken. You can't go back from that, certainly not easily. You can't go back from that in terms of our own citizens' trust in the democratic system. You can't go back from that in terms of the way the world sees American democracy. And so I hope that as this comes before the House of Representatives, as this continues moving through, that everybody, not just legislators, but everybody who can influence legislators, recognize that this isn't something we can just play with. This isn't just another issue. This is about democracy itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Judge Hidalgo. And Senator Alvarado, I know that you represent Harris County as well and have been in the thick of this in the fight on the Senate floor yesterday. Can you talk to us a little bit about a couple of the provisions that you were most concerned about?
Yes, and I want to thank Lina Hidalgo and the leadership in Harris County for putting together a very safe plan for voting during a pandemic. And as I said last night, let's call out the big elephant in the room. And I wasn't talking about the Republican mascot. This was mainly started because of the successful effort that took place in Harris County. 128,000 people in Harris County used the drive-through voting, and a majority of them were either Black, Latino, or Asian. 60% were women. So to take out these provisions and to put a spin on this, that they're somehow going to expand hours from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., that spin makes it sound like there's voting that's going to be able to occur between those hours. But what it is, it's taken a clear shot at Harris County because of the late night extended hours that Harris County had that allowed doctors, people who work in plants, shift workers to be able to go and take advantage of late night voting. We have tried to pass things like online voter registration that have made it nowhere. So it just continues. We continue to see the path of voter suppression in Texas. And what you saw last night was a clear violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And once again, you will see Texas in the courts because of these lawsuits. Just in 2020, the Brennan Center noted that there were 38 lawsuits involving Texas in just 1 year. So we're going to continue to add to that. I appreciate the work that our members of Congress are doing and the advocacy of Beto and Julian and my partners in the House. We hope that maybe there's something that they can do today to stop it. I'm going to have to get off because we have a caucus meeting that I have to attend.
Thank you, Senator Alvarado. And hope maybe we can start encouraging your colleagues to include those litigation costs in the fiscal notes since they rack up pretty quickly.
Yes, thank you.
So before we turn to reporter questions, want to get a question to Texas Democratic Party Chairman Gilberto Hinojosa. And Judge Hinojosa, one of the provisions of this bill that is also new that we haven't seen in other versions of it would make it harder for Texans to register and to vote. But we know that Texans are fighters and that we are going to fight back against these provisions if they do pass today. And Texans will still be able to vote these Republican members, lieutenant governor, and the governor out in 2022. They'll all be on the ballot. So despite Republicans' best efforts, after today, we will still live in a democracy. So what should Texans who are incensed by SB 7 and these attacks on voting rights do now?
Rose, thank you for that question. And thank you for all the hard work you've done. Chad Dunn, our general counsel for the Democratic Party, as well as all the other allied groups like AFL-CIO, the ACLU have been working and providing support to the members of the legislature that have stood up against this horrible voter suppression legislation that they have gotten through the Senate up to now. 65 years ago, during the Montgomery boycott, there was an elderly lady of declining health by the name of Sister Pollard, who insisted on walking in spite of her age and declining health. And when she was asked how she felt about having to walk instead of taking the bus during this entire time, her response was, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Texans are going to stand up to this horrible voter suppression legislation, and it's going to make them want to go out and vote more because they understand the consequences of not voting, because they know that there is consequences in elections, that they know when they vote, they elect the leaders that care about them, that are going to go out there and fight for them to ensure that we have expanded Medicaid, to ensure that we have a minimum wage that's livable, to make sure that our kids have a quality education and college. And so for all these reasons, I believe that this is going to boomerang on the Republicans. I think it's going to get people angry in churches that won't be able to do polls to the souls in mourning. You're going to see some pastors move the services up to after 1 o'clock. I mean, we're not going to put up with this. And so one of the things that they've tried to do, for example, is to make it even harder than what it already is to get people to register by preventing us from sending voters who are not registered to vote pre-filled out applications. All that's going to happen as a result of that is we're just going to have to work a little bit harder. People are out there just going to have to take extra steps to ensure that the people that they know, their sons, their daughters, their neighbors, their comadres and compadres, as we say in the Mexican-American community, are registered to vote and have their voices heard in this next election, because they're tired. Their feet are tired too. And their souls will not be rested until we get rid of these Republicans that, instead of spending their time in fixing our grid and making sure that people have the quality of life that they deserve in Texas, and that we do all the things to ensure that we don't have a pandemic like we had before, or 700 people die as a result of a power shortage in this Texas, that we elect people that are going to be fighting for all Texans. So yeah, they're making it harder, but what they're doing is they're making it harder on themselves, because our folks are just not going to take this lying down. They're going to go out there and fight even harder. They're going to make sure that they're going to get past all these obstacles. Absolutely. They've done it once before, and they're going to do it again.
Thank you, Judge Hinojosa. And Congressman O'Rourke, I know that your organization, Powered by People, has been hard at work during the spring, getting folks registered to vote. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to build on all these great comments, we've got to fight for a very important Senate bill for the people. And that means calling the White House, letting President Biden know that you want him to make this his number one priority. It means having the back of Carol Alvarado and Jessica Gonzalez and our other great fighters and champions. Getting behind your Texas Democratic Party. Rose, you and your team have done an amazing job. Other groups like Move Texas, Texas Civil Rights Project, Texas Rising, Texas Freedom Network. That's one of the silver linings in all of this, is this really horrific bill has brought a lot of great people together. But even if this thing passes and is signed into law, that's not enough. We've got to get out there and register people to vote. So in your home county, whichever of the 254 you live, go down, see your local elections administrator, get trained to become a volunteer deputy registrar or a VDR, and then go start knocking on your neighbors' doors to find out if they're registered to vote or not. And if they're not registered, let's have a conversation with them now in 2021 and not wait until 2022 about how important our elections are and the right to vote. And let's get them signed up so that they can vote in the next election. And Rose, last thing, Powered by People and all of our great volunteers are putting together a tour of Texas cities. And we're going to be in Midland next week. We'll be in Lubbock. We'll be in Wichita Falls. We're going to travel the state. We'd love to join you and others who are on this call to rally and bring people together in this fight for voting rights. Let's not take anyone for granted. Let's not leave anyone out of the conversation. Let's bring everyone in. And so if you want to join us, we'd love to see you out there. More news on this coming soon, but let's all do all that we can with what we have, where we are right now. As Lina Hidalgo said, this is our democracy on the line, and we can't lose it.
Thank you. And one last question before we turn to some media questions. Secretary Castro, you were the mayor of San Antonio, and your organization works closely with many local leaders. What is this going to look like on the ground for those local leaders, or how can they get into the fight? And what should we be asking our local elected officials who might be a little bit more responsive to our requests to do?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure if this legislation does pass. Well, first, I would say contact your local elected officials, from city council members, county commissioners, even school board members, and encourage them to do what they can in these next few hours to block this, to stop it. But if it passes, then everybody needs to work to make sure that their constituents understand the new rules, that people do get registered to get out there and register others to vote, as Congressman O'Rourke said. And also, very importantly, and this is the work that we're doing with People First Future, that leaders at every level emerge because of this, from school board candidates to city council candidates, candidates for county commission, and so forth. You can be empowered by running for office. And so for all of those folks who are thinking about doing it, I hope that this will be one more impetus to get involved in this democratic process.
Thank you. Absolutely. And on behalf of the Texas Democratic Party, I can certainly say that we want folks running up and down the ballot in every part of the state. So if you are motivated to do that, please move that forward. And we would love to help you and to talk about that, because we need more leaders in every corner of the state to fight for democratic values. So we have a couple of questions from media. And just as a reminder, members of the media, you can put any questions you have in the chat and send them to the host. That's Luke Warford. And then if you could include your publication name, please. So we have a question from Chuck Lindell at the Austin American-Statesman. What provisions of SB 7 are vulnerable to a constitutional or Voting Rights Act challenge? I know we have a voting rights lawyer and someone who has already started down this conversation in Representative Gonzalez. Do you have some thoughts to kick us off on that, Representative?
You know, I'll leave a lot of that to the elections lawyers. They've been working with us all session, but. I don't have the answer to that right now. But definitely there will be litigation on this matter.
And in your committee, we certainly heard lots of those organizations all but threaten that, didn't we?
Absolutely. I mean, these questions were asked, on almost every single bill. A lot of them that we heard in committee, but that are incorporated in this bill. When asking those questions, hey, have you done a race analysis, impact analysis? No, we don't keep up with that information. We don't keep up with, a demographic, that data when, they prosecute or when they're investigating voter fraud. And that's important. And so, whether they do actually keep up with it and they just didn't want to share that. My understanding is that in the past, when these similar questions were asked and they said that they did not keep that information, it came out later on in litigation that they actually did. And so that really goes to show their intent. And so, these bad actors still exist. And so, we're gonna get down to it when it gets signed into law, which hopefully, there's still that hope that it won't, but we still got a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question about litigation? I know it's always a sticky subject, so fair if not.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Chairman, I can take it, Chairman. I was a voting rights litigator. I've done Section 2 claims. Obviously, it might be a shorter list what parts of this bill would not be challengeable under Section 2 than to talk about, because I think almost every provision has something in it that is clearly intentionally racially discriminatory. And that's what we're looking at here when we talk about a Section 2 claim. But particularly in the most egregious thing that we have to talk about, we've mentioned it several times, is moving the early voting period window from 1 to 9 on a Sunday. There is no rationale, and that's what the court will ask you. What's the rational basis for this law? There's no rationale that they can provide to indicate why it is in the state's interest to move Sunday elections from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. How is that in the state's interest? Just on Sunday. And there's plenty of data, and they know, and there's someone else who knows, and we will find out through litigation just who put that in this bill and why it was put in there. But to me, it's so egregious. And I heard Senator West say this last night from Dallas. I want to thank him for his work late into the night. Just talk about how ridiculous it is that, his constituents will be able to get a beer at 10 a.m. on Sunday, but won't be able to walk out of church and go to the polling place. I mean, it's just, it highlights, I think, how sloppy this legislation is. I think it highlights how just intentional the discrimination is. And yes, it will end up in court. And yes, it will cost Texans millions of dollars in defending of your tax dollars. And so, again, I think we could go through section by section and pick something in every part that could probably be challenged legitimately. But to me, this is not a difficult bill to say that it's going to be challenged. And, that's something that obviously the election lawyers are going to have to get into. But as someone who's done it before, I can tell you this will end up in court. And I expect the state of Texas will lose and lose a lot of money as well.
If I can jump in also, Rose, on some of the things that Congressman Allard said, that can you hear me? Okay. I had a long talk yesterday with our general counsel, Chad Dunn, and the first portion of the bill that he brought up that is problematic as a legal point is the elimination of Sunday morning voting. That is clearly would be thrown out, even under existing law. But I think what's important to point out, though, with respect to what's out there, the John R. Lewis Bill 4 will provide for pre-clearance by the Justice Department. And the congressman knows this, having worked there before, that when you're talking about pre-clearance by the Justice Department, the Justice Department looks at discriminatory impact. And if you have a provision, for example, that prevents people from assisting people in filling out voter registration cards in the manner that the party has done in the past, that clearly impacts African Americans and Mexican Americans in this state. And so if the John R. Lewis bill passes, all of these provisions have an impact on minorities one way or the other. And it's likely that very few of them will get past Justice Department pre-clearance. And one of the things that I have heard, and I may be wrong, but in what I have read, is that the one bill that may be able to pass without being filibustered is H.R. 4 or House Bill 4. I don't remember if it's an HR or HB. The John Lewis bill. The Senate members that have been holding out have expressed to President Biden that is one bill that they may go ahead and agree to. And that would make a big difference with respect to this legislation. And in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of a lot of voting rights lawyers, and I'm not a voting rights lawyer, but in the opinion of a lot of voting rights lawyers, that would knock out 2/3 of this bill with respect to its discriminatory impact on minorities, because that's what it's intended to do. They're not trying to stop Republicans from going out to vote. They're trying to stop Democrats from going out to vote. And the base of the Democratic Party is overwhelmingly African American and Hispanic, who vote mostly Democrat, and a lot of Asian Americans who are also voting in large percentages for Democrats. That's what they're trying to do. That can be seen clearly, and that's, I believe, with the Justice Department that we're going to have, with the Civil Rights Division that we have, who has a woman who is an old civil rights, voting rights lawyer heading it today, I think we'll be able to knock out a bunch of those portions of the bill.
Thank you, Judge Hinojosa. So in wrapping up, our state legislators had to go back to their day jobs and fighting this fight on the floor today. Our state representatives are, unfortunately, Representative Collier couldn't join us because she is on the floor fighting this fight and trying to be part of this last effort to prevent Senate Bill 7 from becoming law, because the House has to pass this bill today for it to move forward. So we still have a fighting chance, and our representatives are fighting that fight and trying to do everything that we possibly can to prevent it. And they're powered by so many of you who have called their offices and told them that you are in this with them. So thank you for doing that. But before we wrap up, does anyone else have any final thoughts or anything that folks should know as we close out? Okay, we had such a great discussion today. We so appreciate everyone who is able to join us and all of you being part of this fight in different ways and rallying your constituents and your communities and all of the folks who have been so vocal on this fight all session. Thank you all for being a part of that and for making that happen. We are only at this point where there is still a possibility that we are not going to have this terrible voting law because of every single person who has made a call, joined a rally, tweeted and texted, and all of the things that you all have done. So thank you for being a part of this. Please keep up the pressure today. And then, we still have to, the governor would still have to sign it. He's indicated he would, but we need to fight with every breath we have. So we're going to keep telling you how to do that, how to push back against this. And then we'll turn to our federal legislators and look toward HR 1 and HR 4 to help Texas and help Texas